Think of your brain as a tangled knot of rubber bands that never actually untie. Most of the time, those bands are stretched tight between who you think you are and the next thought you need to solve. Scientists have discovered this specific network fires whenever you aren't doing anything specific, but worrying about yourself instead of the world. It keeps you alive, but it also keeps you stuck in your own head. The problem is, trying to stop it usually makes the knot tighter because your brain notices the effort to stay quiet. So what if silence wasn't something you achieved mentally, but something you forced physiologically until the network simply lost its connection? How much of your life is just you fighting your own biology? Think of your consciousness like a radio tuned to a specific frequency. Most of the time, that frequency is internal chatter about your own life. Neuroscientists call this loop the default mode network. It keeps you safe by reminding you who you are, but it also keeps you stuck in the past or worried about the future. The breakthrough comes when we realize this network isn't always active. When certain physiological states occur, like a shift in breath depth, the brain loses its grip on that self-referential loop. It is as if the software forgets who it is running. This explains why you feel time disappear during flow states. You aren't just distracted, the biological mechanism for you has temporarily gone offline. But there is a specific window in your physiology where this happens automatically without effort. Most people train to control their minds, but what if we need to break the connection instead? There is one physiological reset that forces this silence when you least expect it. Think about the voice that narrates your day. It never stops, even when you're trying to rest. That voice runs on what neuroscientists call the default mode network. It keeps identity alive by replaying who you are. But here is where it gets unsettling. We usually think control means keeping that network active. Instead, true silence happens when we desynchronize it completely. Research shows masters of meditation don't push thoughts away. Their brains stop connecting the dots between the front and back of their heads. It's like a circuit breaker tripping to save power during a storm. They aren't fighting noise, they are cutting the line. It implies our sense of self is just a specific frequency, one that can be turned off on command. So if we can switch it off, what happens to time when the observer disappears? Imagine your brain has a radio channel that only plays you, your name, your worries, your plans. Scientists call this the default mode network. It fires when you stare at a wall or scroll on your phone. But here's the glitch. Trying to silence it usually makes it louder. The paradox of effort is that focusing on stopping thoughts just keeps them alive. New studies suggest that true silence isn't about control, it's about uncoupling specific brain regions like the MPFC and PCC. It's as if you're unplugging a conversation happening in your own skull. We know meditators show weaker connections between these areas, but we are looking for something sharper, a switch rather than a volume knob. If this network drives the sense of self, then turning it off might explain why time vanishes during flow states. But there is a cost to disconnecting the narrator from the story. Think about staring at a wall until your eyes water. Your brain is not working harder, it is actually shutting down specific loops. Scientists have mapped the default mode network as the source of our wandering thoughts, but recent imaging shows this network physically uncouples during deep meditation. The medial prefrontal cortex stops talking to the posterior cingulate, creating a biological gap where you usually reside. This explains why silence often feels like noise initially. Your brain is forced to process the absence of its own voice. If we can induce that disconnect voluntarily, maybe we can stop constant mental chatter without trying to control it at all. The problem is finding a machine precise enough to mimic that specific neural fatigue without putting you to sleep. We are searching for a protocol that mimics the body's natural disconnection point and finally breaks the loop of the thinking self. We all know the feeling of staring at a wall while your mind wanders. It's not laziness, it is the default mode network taking over. This brain system keeps you safe by replaying social scenarios and rehearsing survival strategies. But new imaging suggests we can starve this network into silence. Elite meditators show a functional disconnect between their awareness center and their memory hub. They don't just stop thinking, they uncouple the hardware that generates the self. Most standard training fails because it keeps the monitor running while trying to quiet the screen. The goal isn't better focus, it is finding the specific physiological trigger that lets the map fall away while you remain alive in the territory. But exactly what signal tells the brain to release its grip on identity? Here is where it gets uncomfortable. You know how you try to stop thinking about something and end up thinking about it more? That is your brain looping on itself. The research calls this the default mode network. Imagine a radio station that plays in the background of every conversation, but never seems to get switched off. Most mindfulness techniques accidentally feed this station by making you monitor your thoughts. But experts found people who truly dissolve that sense of self actually show weaker connections between two regions deep in the brainstem and cortex. It is as if the electrical wiring between your planning center and your remembering center gets temporarily unplugged. This creates the biological equivalent of a reset button. When the network stops syncing, the story you tell yourself about being a continuous thinker falls apart. And this brings us to the question of how we force that disconnect without years of practice. Most of us know that stress tightens the brain, but have you considered that silence tightens it too? When we try hard not to think about our thoughts, we often just add another layer of worry on top of the noise. It is like standing still in a river, trying to stop the water from flowing. The more force you use, the faster the current becomes. Researchers found that advanced meditators do not fight this flow, they ride it. By desynchronizing the network usually responsible for our internal narrative, they physically uncouple the loop that tells us who we are. This creates a gap in consciousness that is not empty, but simply unoccupied by time. But here's where it gets tricky. If the mind cannot hold this state naturally through will alone, perhaps the structure itself is limiting the experience. We might need something external to force this disconnect, something that does not ask for permission from the ego to shut down its own machinery. We've spent time mapping the territory of your own mind, and here is what the data finally tells us. You have been trying to solve a biology problem with a psychology solution. Every time you tell yourself not to think about something, that thing becomes the loudest story running through your default mode network. The breakthrough isn't finding more clarity in the noise. It is realizing that the noise itself is just a signal loop waiting to be broken. Think of it like a car idling in neutral. The engine is revving, but the wheels are free. That empty space between thoughts is where the actual work happens. To access it, you have to stop driving the narrative and let the physiology run the show. The full research archive is at jmthomasofficial.com.